Just a quick heads up before we drop the needle on today's track. This episode dives into the absolute worst, most brutal realities of American history. We will be discussing systematic racial terror, human trafficking, explicit instances of child abuse, and intense, graphic guerrilla warfare, including executions and close encounters combat. John Brown's insurgency was not a peaceful protest. It was a bloody, violent war against a monstrous system. The details get incredibly heavy, but they are entirely necessary to understand the extreme actions he took. Please take care of yourself while listening. I want you to close your eyes. Block out the modern world and completely immerse your senses in this exact scene. You're standing in the pitch black dark on a cold, rain-swept railway bridge crossing the rushing, turbulent waters of the Potomac River. It's October 16th, 1859, just after 11 o'clock at night. The rain is not a heavy downpour. It is a misting, freezing, relentless drizzle that slowly soaks right through heavy wool coats until it clings to your skin. The night air is thick and heavy, smelling of wet, rusted iron, river mud, rotting timber, and the deep, damp decay of autumn leaves. If you listen closely beneath the sound of the wind, you can hear the low, ominous roar of the rushing currents slamming against the stone pillars of the bridge. Ahead of you lies Harpers Ferry, Virginia. To a casual observer, in 1859, it looks like a sleepy, quiet, completely unthreatening town nestled deep in a steep, tree-covered mountain gorge where there are two massive rivers, the Potomac and the Shenandoah, collide with brutal physical force. But the tiny mountain town is holding a staggering, dangerous secret: a massive United States federal arsenal. Behind the towering iron gates sits a complex of heavy brick buildings packed to the absolute ceiling with over 100,000 government-manufactured rifles, muskets, and pistols. It is, for all intents and purposes, the military heart of the nation. It is a goldmine of raw, destructive firepower. Suddenly, a small, tight group of figures emerges from the creeping river fog and the deep, ink-black shadows of the bridge's iron trusses. They don't look like a regular army. They look like ghosts. Leading the pack is a tall, wire-thin old man. He has a wild, wind-blown gray beard that reaches his chest and piercing, intense eyes that seem to catch the dim moonlight and reflect it back with the terrifying absolute clarity. He is wearing a heavy, rain-slicked, tattered overcoat that is deliberately hiding a massive Bowie knife tucked into his belt. His calloused, weather-beaten hands, the hands of a lifelong farmer and laborer, are gripped tightly around the cold steel barrel of a Sharps rifle. Walking completely silently behind him are 21 young radicals. These are his own sons, boys he raised on the frontier farms, alongside 5 black men, including men born free in the North, men who had spent their entire life scraping together pennies to purchase their freedom from human traffickers, and an escaped fugitive who had recently fled the Deep South. Every single one of these 21 men has willingly, consciously volunteered for a military mission with a near 0% chance of survival. They are completely outmatched, outfunded, and outnumbered. Their boots crunch quietly on the wet gravel as they step off the bridge and onto Virginia soil. They move with an absolute military precision, a product of months of hiding. They walk right up to the lone federal watchman guarding the complex. Before he can even process the figures emerging from the fog, they press the cold steel of a gun barrel against his chest, demanding his absolute silence. 2 young men scramble up the wooden telegraph poles, their tools sparking in the dark as they cut through the thick copper wires, instantly severing the town's connection to the outside world. Communication is dead. And then, with a low, heavy groan of metal, they heave open the towering iron armory gates and step inside. To the United States government, to the incredibly wealthy southern plantation owners who held millions of human beings in chains, to the comfortable politicians sitting in their plush, warm offices in Washington, D.C., this exact moment was completely, utterly unthinkable. A tiny, underfunded DIY squad of private citizens was declaring open, armed war on a global superpower. It was a psychological bomb dropped right onto the tracks of American history. It was the ultimate real-time guerrilla action against an unjust establishment. The trap was sprung. Think punk started in the 70s? Think again. I'm Andrew Winter. Welcome back to Punk's Pre-Punk, a podcast where I show you how the confrontational mindset, unyielding determination, and raw defiance of punk rock were blazing a trail long before bands like Death or The Damned. On today's episode, we're diving deep into the life of John Brown. He was a 59-year-old guy with a massive white beard. He was a man who looked like an angry Old Testament prophet, who realized that when the fundamental law of the land protects and legally enforces human torture, being an outlaw is the absolute only moral choice a living, breathing person has left. He did not write polite letters to his congressman. He did not ask for a slow, peaceful compromise that would kick the can down the road for another generation to deal with. He picked up a heavy iron broadsword, loaded Sharp's rifles, and then went to war for the ultimate underdog. In this episode, we're blowing the doors off the standard textbook narrative. You're going to hear the incredible, tense, blow-by-blow account of how he organized a highly secret, fully integrated squad of young radicals to stage that daring midnight raid on a heavily guarded federal weapons armory, intentionally trapping himself inside a brick fortress to force a national crisis that the country could no longer ignore or sweep under the rug. You will learn how his absolute, unwavering refusal to back down on the gallows completely lit the fuse for the American Civil War, forcing a violent, divided nation to finally reckon with its foundational sins. But near the very end of this episode, I'm going to reveal the wild story of what happened after he was executed. I'll tell you how his name was instantly turned into the ultimate underground protest anthem, a track so infectious, so incredibly rebellious that the Union Army literally sang it at the top of their lungs while marching into artillery fire to tear down the plantation system. Mainstream history often leaves out just how much his legacy functioned like the very first true punk rock anthem, and I think you're absolutely gonna love it. And finally, in a new closing segment, I'm going to break down exactly, or what it might be like, to sit down and hang out with the man himself on something like a casual Tuesday afternoon. So stick around until the end to find out how that song changed the world, and what it might be like to hang out with this true punk revolutionary. Act 1. The Making of a Radical Mind. To understand how a white, deeply religious family man from New England transforms into a legendary midnight insurgent, you have to look backward. You have to look at what John Brown saw when he was just a little kid, because the deep roots of his radicalization start in the absolute dirt, mud, and harsh realities of the early 19th century. John Brown was born in the year 1800 in Torrington, Connecticut. He was raised in a strictly, almost punishingly religious Calvinist household. Now, Calvinism is tense. It's a worldview steeped in the idea of a harsh, judgmental God, a universe of absolute rights and wrongs, but it also taught John a very simple, very dangerous truth: that all human beings, regardless of their station, wealth, or skin color, are created completely, unequivocally equal in the eyes of an almighty creator. His father, Owen Brown, was a tanner by trade. If you don't know what early 19th century tanning looks like, it was a brutal, physically destructive way to make a living. It involves dragging raw, bloody animal hides into freezing vats of harsh chemical baths, scraping the fat and rotting tissue off with heavy, sharpened iron knives, and breathing in the absolute worst stenches imaginable from dawn until dusk. It was hard, bloody, muscle-straining work. But Owen was also a fiercely principled man. He actively smuggled escaping human beings along the very highly dangerous, unmapped routes of the Underground Railroad, hiding terrified people in the hay of his barn. From the time John could walk and talk, he grew up watching his father break federal laws in secret. He understood early on that laws of men absolutely meant nothing if they contradicted the fundamental laws of human decency. When John was just 12 years old, the United States was plunged into the chaotic violence of the War of 1812. He was already a fiercely independent, tough child, forced to grow up way too fast in a frontier environment. He was actually tasked entirely on his own with driving a large herd of cattle through the brutal, unmapped wilderness all the way to Detroit in the Michigan Territory to deliver beef to the struggling American army. Imagine being a 12-year-old kid entirely on your own, navigating miles of dense, ancient forest choked with thick brush, freezing mud, dangerous river crossings, and the constant threat of wild animals and unpredictable weather. It was on this specific lonely journey that John's entire worldview was shattered and violently reassembled. While staying at the home of a local landlord, a man who, chillingly enough, was actually a United States Marshal sworn to uphold the law of the land, John befriended a young enslaved black boy. This boy was John's exact age. He was incredibly intelligent, quick-witted, and the two kids quickly bonded the way that 12-year-olds normally do when they're thrown together in the frontier. They played in the dirt, talked about animals, and shared stories. But John was horrified to witness the stark, sickening contrast of how they were treated by the adults in the house. John, simply because he was a white guest, was fed warm, hearty meals by the crackling hearth. He was praised by the adults for his independence and given a thick, warm bed to sleep in. The young black boy, however, despite being just as smart and just as young, was dressed in threadbare, filthy rags. He was forced to sleep shivering in the bitter cold corner of the kitchen away from the fire and was treated with absolute, casual, dehumanizing cruelty every single day. The breaking point, the specific moment that created the militant John Brown we know today, came on a cold evening in a dimly lit, smoke-filled room. John watched in paralyzing, breathless horror as the landlord, the United States Marshal, took a heavy, blackened iron fire shovel from the fireplace and savagely, brutally began to beat the young boy for a minor, completely meaningless offense. John stood there in the deep, flickering shadows of the room, completely paralyzed with fear and disgust. He watched the dull, soot-stained iron violently strike the boy's bare skin, leaving deep, bloody welts. He listened to the horrific sounds of the iron hitting flesh and the boy's desperate cries echoing in the small, cramped cabin. He realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that this boy had no father or mother to protect him. The law, the society, the marshal, the entire world was perfectly designed to allow this grown man to beat this child to death if he so choose. And absolutely no one in civilized society would stop him from doing it. That specific, visceral image of raw child abuse permanently burned itself into John's brain. It was a severe trauma that slowly morphed over decades into a terrifying, unshakable clarity. He looked at the bruised, bleeding boy, and then he looked at the comfortable, civilized white society around him that allowed this to happen every single day across millions of acres of American soil, and he experienced a profound moral awakening. He later wrote in his memoirs that this specific, violent moment made him swear an eternal, unbreakable oath to hunt down the monster of slavery until his last dying breath. He looked up at the sky and asked himself if God was not the father of this boy as well. And if God was the father of that boy, then what did that make the men who tortured him? It made them agents of the devil. And John Brown decided his life's purpose was to fight that devil. Act 2. The Wilderness Years and the Shift in Strategy. John did not join a polite political club, sip tea in a nice northern parlor, and discuss abolitionism as an abstract moral concept. As he grew older, married, and raised an astounding 20 children across 2 marriages, his life was defined by intense, crushing, relentless struggle and personal tragedy. He failed at business after business in the brutal early American economy. He tried to be a tanner like his father, scraping hides until his knuckles bled. He tried to be a land surveyor, walking miles through the lonely woods plotting property lines. He tried being a sheep farmer and a wool merchant. He went completely bankrupt, losing everything he owned. He was constantly sued by wealthy creditors and dragged into court. He lost multiple children to horrific, preventable frontier diseases like dysentery, burying them with his own hands in tiny, shallow graves dug into the hard, unforgiving earth while the family wept in the cold. He lived in dusty, cramped, relentless poverty for most of his adult life. He knew exactly what it felt like to be crushed and pushed to the absolute margins of a ruthless, unforgiving capitalist system. And while the mainstream wealthy white abolitionists in the North gave polite, flowery speeches in carpeted, sunlit churches, pushing polite essays and organizing polite boycotts of slave-grown sugar, John Brown took a radically different, hands-on path. He took his family and moved to a remote, freezing, isolated settlement in the Adirondack Mountains of New York called Timbuktu. This settlement was a radical land grant created by a wealthy abolitionist specifically for free black families so they can own property, farm, and clear the legal hurdles required to vote in New York. John Brown, a white man, intentionally moved his entire family into this black community to teach farming in the rocky, unforgiving mountain soil. He sat at their dinner tables, shared their meager meals, and listened closely to the harrowing, first-hand stories of self-liberated people who escaped the whips of the Deep South. He absorbed their trauma, their anger, and their desperate desire for total freedom. It was during these harsh, howling winters in the mountains that John fully realized that talking nicely to slave owners was completely, laughably useless. The Southern plantation class was making millions upon millions of dollars off of the human trafficking. They were surrounded by manicured lawns, massive plantation houses with towering white pillars, and immense political power. They practically owned the presidency, the courts, and the banks. They were not going to wake up one day and give up their free labor force just because a northern preacher gave a nice speech about Christian morality. John realized a fundamental, undeniable truth of power dynamics. If a system is held together entirely by violence, by the crack of the leather whip, by the teeth of the bloodhound, and by the iron chains, you have to use a bigger, heavier, sharper counterforce to break it. You have to speak to the oppressor in the absolute only language the oppressor truly understands: physical force and the threat of total destruction. Act 3. Bleeding Kansas and the Birth of the Guerrilla. By the 1850s, the United States was actively tearing itself apart at the seams. The federal government, desperately trying to appease the wealthy southern states and hold on to the fragile Union together, passed the catastrophic Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law was an absolute nightmare for free black people and abolitionists. It legally forced northern citizens, regardless of their personal moral beliefs, to act as slave catchers. It meant that a black person who had lived freely in Boston or New York for 20 years, raised a family, and built a legitimate business could suddenly be snatched off the street by a federal marshal, denied a trial, and dragged back to South Carolina in chains, and it was highly illegal for anyone to try and stop it. Then, the newly opened territory of Kansas exploded into a horrifying miniature civil war known to history as Bleeding Kansas. The government decided that the white settlers moving to Kansas would vote on whether the new state would be free or slave. Instantly, heavily armed pro-slavery border ruffians flooded across the border from Missouri. They rode on horseback, waving flags, drinking whiskey, and firing pistols into the air. They terrorized anti-slavery settlers. They burned down wooden frontier towns, leaving massive plumes of black smoke billowing across the open prairie. They dragged people from their homes and murdered activists in cold blood to violently suppress the Free State vote. John Brown looked at this terrifying situation in Kansas and said, "The time for talking is officially permanently over. The war has already started. The North has just not realized it yet." But John wasn't actually the first member of his family to head to the front lines. In the spring of 1854, 5 of his adult sons, John Jr., Jason, Owen, Frederick, and Salmon, decided to move out to the territory themselves. They wanted to build free soil family farms, but more importantly, they wanted to help tip the scales and vote to ensure Kansas entered the country as a free state. They traveled west with nothing but standard farming equipment, basic livestock, and a few family belongings. But when they arrived, they realized they had walked right into a heavily armed trap. Pro-slavery border ruffians completely surrounded their claims, constantly riding past their homes, threatening to burn down their crops, and explicitly promising to murder any anti-slavery families who didn't pack up and get out. The boys quickly realized that a hand plow was completely useless when your neighbor is pointing a pistol at your head. In the spring of 1855, John Jr. sent a desperate, pleading letter back to his father in New York. They didn't ask for money to fix the farms. They didn't ask for winter clothes to survive the elements. They explicitly wrote, "We need arms more than anything else, and we need them right away." The moment John Brown read that letter, the old spark exploded. He didn't hesitate. He immediately packed up his creaking wooden wagon, but he didn't fill it with seeds or building supplies. He loaded that wagon down with heavy wooden crates packed tight with Sharps rifles, Colt revolvers, kegs of gunpowder, and a cache of heavy razor-sharp artillery broadswords. He left his wife and younger children behind in the freezing mountains of New York, gathered his remaining sons and his son-in-law, and drove that wagon of weapons straight into the dusty, blood-soaked war zone of the Kansas Territory. He was no longer just a father to help his boys, he was a commander heading to the front. John did not play by the rules of conventional, gentlemanly warfare. When pro-slavery militants attacked the Free State town of Lawrence, smashing expensive printing presses, burning down the hotel, and terrorizing the citizens, John Brown decided the brutal eye-to-eye retribution was absolutely required. He believed that pro-slavery forces needed to feel the exact same terror, the exact same vulnerability that they were inflicting on other innocent people. In May of 1856, John led a small, heavily armed squad to a settlement along Pottawatomie Creek in the middle of a pitch-black night. Quietly wading through thigh-high prairie grass, armed with those heavy, old-school artillery broadswords that caught the faint glint of starlight, his squad approached the rough-hewn log cabins of a prominent pro-slavery settler who had been actively threatening Free State families with violence and death. They banged on the heavy wooden doors. They dragged 5 men out into the cold, damp, dark grass of the wilderness. And right there under the night sky, using the swords to ensure silence and conserve ammunition, they executed them. They hacked them to death in the dirt. It was a massive, terrifying shockwave. It was brutal, it was horrifying, and it completely changed the calculus in Kansas. The pro-slavery forces realized they were no longer fighting pacifist politicians from the Northeast. They were fighting religious zealots who were entirely willing to spill blood to win the territory. John Brown permanently became a legendary, shadowy guerrilla icon. He was known across the territory as Old Osawatomie Brown. He spent the next few years living out in the dense brush, sleeping on the hard dirt, constantly on the move to avoid federal dragoons and bounty hunters. He ran a heavily mobile, incredibly disciplined tactical squad that ambushed slave hunting militias on dusty, dirty roads. They engaged in pitched gun battles like the Battle of Blackjack and the Battle of Osawatomie, where John watched his own son Frederick get shot dead in the street and watched the town burn to ashes in front of his eyes. But John didn't just fight white militias. He launched daring, highly illegal cross-border raids directly into the slave state of Missouri. He would strike a plantation in the dead of night, liberate the enslaved people held there at gunpoint, seize the master's horses and wagons, and successfully smuggle dozens of black human beings thousands of miles north. They traveled across frozen rivers, hiding in freezing barns, dodging federal marshals all the way to absolute freedom across the border in Canada. During these desperate years in the wilderness, John Brown developed a fundamental intellectual theory that perfectly mirrors the absolute core of the punk rock mindset. He concluded that when the entire state apparatus, the presidency, the Supreme Court, the military, and the local police force is completely, totally weaponized to protect human torture, the entire legal system loses all moral authority. Being a law-abiding citizen under a monstrous regime does not make you a good person. It makes you a silent, complicit collaborator. True justice in a society built on fundamental evil requires you to become a total, unapologetic outlaw. Act 4. The Rogues Gallery. Before we march on Harpers Ferry, we need to talk about who was actually standing on that bridge with John Brown. Mainstream history paints these 21 men as brainwashed cult followers or mindless lunatics. But when you look at their actual lives, you realize they were a collection of brilliant, angry, deeply principled young radicals who were sick of waiting for the world to fix itself. This was a DIY, multiracial vanguard. Look at who they were. First, there were his sons, Owen, Watson, and Oliver Brown. These boys didn't grow up in comfort. They grew up on failing farms, watching their father bury their siblings, and running from bounty hunters in Kansas. Oliver was only 20 years old when he stood on that bridge. He had a teenage wife and a newborn baby back home, but he looked at his father and said, "I'm in." Watson was 23, recently married with a child on his way. They weren't brainwashed, they were a family forged in the fire of an ideological war. Then look at the black men who volunteered for this suicide mission. Look at Dangerfield Newby. Dangerfield was born into slavery in Virginia, but his white father had legally freed him. He moved north to Ohio, but his wife Harriet and their 7 children were still held in brutal bondage by a planter in Virginia. Dangerfield worked day and night as a blacksmith, saving every dollar to try and buy his family's freedom. He raised hundreds of dollars, but the master raised the price and refused to sell. Harriet managed to smuggle a letter to Dangerfield in Ohio writing, "Dear husband, come down as soon as you can, for if you do not come down and see me, I'll be sold to the far south. Columns of slave are leaving every day. Oh dear Dangerfield, come buy me and the baby." Dangerfield didn't have the time for politics. He didn't have the time for elections. He joined John Brown because a rifle was the only tool left he could save his children. And look at Shields Green, known as Emperor. Shields was an escaped fugitive from South Carolina. He had managed to flee the Deep South, leaving behind a son, and made his way to Rochester, New York, where he lived in the house of Frederick Douglass. When Douglass met John Brown in that stone quarry in Pennsylvania and refused to join the raid because it was a death trap, Shields Green listened to both men speak. He looked at Douglass, the famous orator, and then looked at the old man with the wild beard who was willing to die for black freedom. Green chose the old man. Look at Anthony Copeland Jr. and Lewis Sheridan Leary. These were 2 young, educated black men from Oberlin, Ohio, a famous hotbed of radical abolitionism. Copeland was a student at Oberlin College, and Leary was a harness maker. They were free, safe, and integrated into a supportive community in the North. But they looked at the millions of their brothers and sisters in chains down south and decided that their personal safety was a form of privilege that they couldn't stomach. They packed their bags, lied to their families, and headed to Maryland to join the raid. And look at the young white radicals like John Cook and Aaron Stevens. Cook was a charismatic law student who had gone undercover in Harpers Ferry a year before the raid, working as a schoolteacher and a lock keeper, scouting the town's defenses and mapping the armory. Stevens was a former U.S. Army soldier and had been court-martialed and jailed for beating an officer who was abusive to a private. He escaped prison, fled to Kansas, joined Brown's militia, and became his military second-in-command. These weren't desperate, uneducated dependents. This was a dedicated, highly ideological group of 20-somethings who looked at the United States in 1859 and decided that being an outlaw was the highest form of patriotism available. Act 5. The Gileadite Defense Network. To truly understand the absolute peak of the pre-punk rebel attitude, the sheer tactical nerve it took to build an underground network against a weaponized establishment, you have to look at the backstory that mirrors the exact defensive philosophy John Brown brought to the streets. You have to look at his time in Springfield, Massachusetts in the late 1840s and early 50s. Springfield was a bustling, chaotic railroad hub, and for John Brown, it became a massive classroom in radical urban resistance. While running a wool merchant business by day, Brown spent his nights embedded deep within Springfield's thriving, highly independent, free black community. He attended their churches, spoke at their community halls, and rented a house that quickly became a core tactical station on the Underground Railroad. It was here that Brown met Frederick Douglass for the first time. Douglass later wrote about walking into Brown's remarkably plain, uncarpeted home and realizing that this white man lived like an austere soldier in a military barracks, entirely focused on a singular mission. When Douglass argued for a political solution to slavery, Brown firmly shook his head, looked Douglass straight in the eye, and told him that the Southern planter class would never give up their human property until they saw their own blood running in the dirt. The true breaking point in Springfield came in 1850, when the federal government dropped the hammer with the Fugitive Slave Act. Rich Southern bounty hunters, backed by the full power of federal marshals, started stalking the streets of northern cities, snatching up self-liberated black citizens right off the sidewalks. John Brown didn't organize a peaceful parade or write a polite editorial to complain. He went straight to his black neighbors and formed a radical, clandestine defense militia called the United States League of Gileadites. This wasn't a debate club. It was a highly organized underground urban defense network. Brown wrote a fiercely political, completely uncompromising manifesto for the group, explicitly instructing them to arm themselves with pistols, knives, and heavy clubs. He told them that if a bounty hunter or a federal marshal ever tried to kidnap a member of their community, they should hit the streets in a massive coordinated crowd and completely overwhelm the authorities by physical force. He explicitly wrote, "Should one of your number be arrested, you must provide a way for his escape at all hazards. Let the first blow be the signal for all to strike." He taught them how to move in teams, how to create chaotic diversions in public squares, and how to use the tight, winding alleys of the city to vanish into the night. Under Brown's leadership, the Gileadites made Springfield a terrifyingly hostile zone for slave catchers. Bounty hunters arrived in town only to find themselves shadowed by silent, armed groups of black citizens staring them down at every corner, completely ready to spark a street war. John Brown didn't wait for a legal decree from Washington to protect his neighbors. He looked at a monstrous law, realized it had zero moral authority, and built a DIY armed mutual defense ring to smash it. The exact same elite insurgent energy is what drove him out of Massachusetts and onto the Rainy Bridge at Harpers Ferry. Act 6. The Master Plan and the Secret Six. By 1858, John Brown had conceived his master plan. He did not want to just fight border skirmishes in the dust of Kansas anymore. He wanted to strike a fatal, decapitating blow directly at the heart of the Southern plantation economy. He wanted to spark a massive nationwide slave liberation war across the entirety of the American South. His grand strategy was incredibly ambitious, bordering on madness. He planned to take a small, highly trained vanguard force and seize the massive federal armory at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Once he controlled the overwhelming stockpile of weapons, he believed the enslaved population of the surrounding countryside would hear of the raid, rise up, and flock to his banner. He would arm them with rifles and pikes, and together they would retreat into the rocky, densely forested peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. From those mountains, they would wage a relentless, endless guerrilla war. They would strike plantations, free more people, recruit them into the army, and expand the operation further and further southward until the entire economic foundation of slavery completely collapsed under the weight of the insurgency. To fund this massive military operation, John Brown traveled back east under an assumed name. He held clandestine meetings with a group of wealthy, radical northern abolitionists who became known as the Secret Six. These were prominent, highly respected men, ministers, doctors, wealthy philanthropists, who secretly funneled thousands of dollars to Brown to buy Sharps rifles, Colt revolvers, and hundreds of menacing iron pikes designed specifically for close quarters combat for those who did not yet know how to shoot a gun. In the sweltering summer of 1859, Brown and his growing squad rented a small, unassuming farmhouse in Maryland, just a few miles across the river from Harpers Ferry. It was known as the Kennedy Farm. For months, 21 heavily armed men hid in the stifling, suffocating heat of the tiny farmhouse attic. They kept completely out of sight during the daylight hours while John's teenage daughter, Annie Brown, sat on the front porch acting as a lookout, pretending to just be a normal farm girl. The tension in the dark, cramped attic must have been absolutely mind-blowing. They spent their days sweating in the dark, studying military tactics, reading the Bible, polishing their weapons, and preparing to launch a total war against the United States of America. Act 7. The Raid on Harpers Ferry. Finally, the long, agonizing waiting was over. On that raining, freezing night in October 1859, John Brown turned to his men in the farmhouse and said, "Men, get on your arms. We will proceed to the ferry." The tiny integrated squad marched down the dark, muddy road toward the river, leading to the scene we talked about at the very beginning of the episode. They successfully captured the armory with astounding speed and precision. They fanned out in the countryside and took high-profile hostages from the surrounding area. One of these hostages was Colonel Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington himself. Brown specifically ordered his men to take a legendary sword that had been given to Washington by Frederick the Great. Brown wanted the powerful symbolism of the Founding Fathers' sword in the hands of a liberation army. But then, the master plan began to rapidly unravel. A Baltimore and Ohio passenger train came rolling down the tracks through the town. Brown's men stopped the train, but in the confusion, fear, and shouting of the darkness, a shot rang out. The first casualty of John Brown's great war against slavery was tragically and ironically a free black baggage handler named Hayward Shepard, who was shot by Brown's men when he did not halt in the dark. Brown eventually made the baffling decision to let the train proceed. This was a fatal tactical error. When the train reached the next station, the conductors immediately wired the authorities in Washington, D.C. that heavily armed abolitionists had seized the federal armory. Furthermore, the massive, overwhelming uprising of enslaved people that Brown had banked his entire strategy on simply did not happen fast enough. A few local slaves did join the fight, taking up arms, but word could not spread quickly enough through the heavily monitored countryside. The local white militias mobilized with terrifying, drunken speed. By the next morning, church bells were ringing furiously across the Virginia countryside, sounding the alarm. Dozens of heavily armed local militias swarmed into Harpers Ferry. They took up sniper positions on the steep hills and brick buildings surrounding the army complex. They began pouring relentless, heavy rifle fire down onto Brown's men. Dangerfield Newby was shot through the neck and killed in the street, his dream of freeing his family ending in the mud. The local militia mutilated his body, cutting off his ears as souvenirs, and left it in the alley for the feral dogs. Realizing they were completely surrounded and taking heavy casualties, Brown and the surviving members of his squad fell back. They took the remaining hostages with them and barricaded themselves inside a small, thick-walled brick building that housed the armory's fire engine. It quickly became known to history as John Brown's Fort. For 2 agonizing days, they fought a desperate, incredibly bloody shootout. The heavy wooden doors of the engine house splintered underneath a massive hail of lead bullets. The air inside that tiny brick room choked them with the acrid, sulfurous smell of black powder smoke and the cloying copper stench of fresh blood. They held out against the local forces until the United States government finally arrived in full force. President James Buchanan dispatched a company of highly trained U.S. Marines from Washington. They were commanded by none other than Colonel Robert E. Lee, accompanied by a flamboyant young cavalry officer named Jeb Stuart. These were the very men who would soon tear the country apart to violently defend slavery, now acting as the armored fist of the federal government to crush the Abolitionist rebellion. Stuart approached the splintered, injured house doors under a white flag of truce and demanded Brown's immediate, unconditional surrender. Brown, holding a rifle and standing in the dark, refused. Stuart stepped aside and waved his hat as a signal. The Marines immediately stormed the doors. They used heavy sledgehammers and a massive wooden ladder to make a makeshift battering ram, violently smashing their way into the brick fortress. A brutal, terrifying hand-to-hand melee erupted inside the smoke-filled, deafening room. Several of Brown's sons were shot and killed point blank, their bodies lying motionless on the cold stone floor. Brown himself knelt beside the body of his dying son, Oliver, who begged his father to shoot him to put him out of his misery. Brown told him, "If you must die, die like a man." Soon Oliver was quiet. Brown kept firing his rifle until the very end. A Marine lieutenant named Israel Green lunged at John Brown and slashed him violently across the neck and head with the light dress sword. Green tried to run Brown completely through, pushing with all his weight, but the blade miraculously struck the heavy brass buckle of John's belt and bent entirely double. Brown was beaten bloody, beaten unconscious, and dragged out of the absolute carnage by his heels, captured alive to face the wrath of the state. Act 8. The Trial, the Gallows, and the Prophecy. The state of Virginia wanted a quick, clean execution to erase the massive embarrassment of the raid. They wanted to silence him. They put John Brown on trial in nearby Charlestown for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, inciting a slave rebellion, and first-degree murder. But John Brown was a brilliant tactician of the media. He refused to play the assigned role of a defeated, penitent criminal begging for mercy. Because his head and neck wounds were so severe, he was literally carried into the courtroom by guards and laid on hard wooden cot in the center of the room. His heavy bandages were stained dark with dried blood. And from that cot, laying flat on his back, he turned his criminal trial into a fiery, nationally publicized platform condemning the institution of slavery. Reporters from across the country sat in the gallery, frantically transcribing his every word, broadcasting his defiance to millions. He was found guilty and asked by the judge if he had anything else to say before sentencing. John Brown slowly stood up. He looked at the judge and the slave-owning jury, and he delivered one of the most powerful, searing speeches in American history. Had I interfered in the matter which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right. And every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. I believe to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, on behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in the slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust encampments, I submit, so let it be done. During his month in the Charlestown jail waiting to die, he wrote dozens of eloquent, passionate letters that were immediately published in northern newspapers. He completely, brilliantly transformed his public image from a violent militant into a holy martyr dying for the sins of the nation. Even famous European writers like Victor Hugo wrote massive public pleas begging for his life to be spared. He was hanged on a crisp, deeply chilled morning on December 2nd, 1859. The field surrounding the towering gallows was packed with thousands of armed soldiers and artillery pieces to prevent any rescue attempt from Northern sympathizers. Among the massive crowd watching him die was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth, who hated Brown but admired his courage, and a stiff, strange artillery instructor from the Virginia Military Institute named Thomas Stonewall Jackson. But right before he walked up the wooden steps to the gallows, right before the coarse hemp rope was placed securely around his neck against the pale winter sky, he handed a small piece of paper to a jail guard. It was his final, terrifying statement to the world. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." It was a terrifyingly accurate prophetic warning that would soon drench the continent. Act 9. The Anthem and the Legacy. Just over a year later, the American Civil War exploded into existence. The blood that John Brown predicted began to flow in massive rivers across the country. And here is where the absolute punk rock legacy truly cements itself into the culture. As Union soldiers, ordinary working class men from the factories of Massachusetts, the farms of New York, and the streets of Ohio marched in massive, dust-kicking columns down south to dismantle the Confederacy by force. They did not sing polite church hymns. They spontaneously created and sang a rough, booming, intimidating marching song about the very man the South had just executed for treason. They marched in unison and sang, "John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave, but his soul is marching on." It was an underground track. It was a DIY anthem of righteous rebellion that spread like absolute wildfire through the military camps. It was so popular, so incredibly infectious, and so deeply threatening to the Southern establishment that eventually a polite Northern writer named Julia Ward Howe heard the soldiers singing it by the campfires. She liked the powerful tune, but thought the lyrics were far too gritty, too radical, and too violent for proper society. So she rewrote the words to make it more acceptable for polite parlor rooms and Sunday services. You might know her sanitized version. It's called the Battle Hymn of the Republic. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." But before it was a sanitized, respectable hymn sung in churches, it was a gritty, militant, pre-punk anthem about a guy who grabbed a heavy sword and fought the law to save human lives. John Brown was not just a historical footnote to be glossed over in a textbook. He was a man who saw the ultimate injustice and threw his entire life, his family, and his future into the grinding, bloody gears of the machine to stop it. That was the ultimate definition of a pre-punk revolutionary. Act 10. Hanging Out with John Brown. To wrap up this episode, I'm introducing a new segment where I look past the dusty history books and ask a very simple, very human question. What would it actually be like to sit down, have a casual coffee, or grab dinner with John Brown? I thought about this for a long time and kept asking myself this question. And honestly, the conclusion I came up with was it would absolutely be terrifying. Hanging out with John Brown would not be relaxing or fun. I suppose I should call it a little different than hanging out with John Brown, but I think you get what I mean. There would be absolutely zero small talk. You could not sit there across the table and casually talk about the weather, or complain about your morning commute, or bring up whatever mundane woodworking hobby or music project you were currently working on. If you sat across the table from John Brown, he would look at you with those piercing steel gray eyes, and he would stare straight through your skull into the absolute depths of your moral soul. He was famously austere and completely ascetic. He did not drink alcohol, he did not care for fine food or flavor, and he was dressed in worn, utilitarian clothes that were meant for survival, not style. So if you're grabbing a meal with him, you would probably be eating a piece of dry hardtack or a plain, unseasoned baked potato. You would be drinking room temperature water and would be desperately trying not to break eye contact while he intensely, aggressively questioned you about what you were personally doing to dismantle systematic oppression in your own community. He had this magnetic, deeply charismatic gravity to him, but it was the inescapable gravity of a black hole. People who met him historically, even wealthy, sophisticated intellectuals like Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry David Thoreau, often noted that they felt entirely inadequate, small, and almost hypnotized in his overwhelming presence. You would walk away from a 1-hour coffee date with John Brown feeling incredibly inspired, intensely guilty about your own inaction, and simultaneously convinced you to immediately go buy a weapon and head for the mountains to fight injustice. It definitely would not be a fun Friday night hang, but it would undoubtedly be the most profound, life-altering conversation you have had in your entire existence. You absolutely would not leave as the same person who sat down. Next week, we're heading into the dark, oppressive landscapes of World War II Europe to talk about a brilliant Austrian psychiatrist who staged a radical rebellion of the mind against the ultimate machine of human destruction. Imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, he refused to let his captors break his spirit, surviving the unimaginable by discovering that the final human freedom can never be taken away. He weaponized psychology, transformed immersive suffering into a profound manifesto on human purpose, and he provided that finding meaning in ultimate acts of defiance. I'm talking about the definitive, intellectual survivalist and frontline rebel of the soul, Viktor Frankl. Thanks again for listening to Punk Spree Punk. If you like today's show, please do all the podcast stuff. Like, subscribe, write a review. I swear I read all of them. Keep questioning authority, and keep punk rocking the boat.